I'm going to talk about Chinese society, and I'm going to talk about some specific issues related to labor issues, since that's what I study. But I'm happy to take questions more generally, and I think you'll see some trends that I talk about in labor that might be applied to other parts of China's social issues. I'm unfortunately publishing a book that won't be here in time for this panel, but it may be in time for Christmas, so you can buy David's book for Mother's Day and Father's Day and my book for Christmas. The book that I'm publishing is called Authoritarian Legality, and it asks this basic question, which is, why has the Chinese Communist Party passed legislation to grant workers more legal rights, publicize these workplace rights through the propaganda and media, and then encourage legal mobilization around these new rights? So why would an authoritarian regime do that? And the argument in the beginning of the book is partly an explanation, which gets to some of the issues that we talked about this morning related to urbanization, that we need to understand the expansion of labor rights in China as a tactical decision on the part of the central government to begin this process of changing China's development model and urbanizing the population very, very rapidly as a way to change the economic growth model towards domestic consumption, towards reduced inequality. And workplace rights play a fundamental part in this because it is the only way by which they hope rural citizens will begin to exchange land. So you exchange land security for employment and employment security. China, like the United States, has built a social welfare system that is relatively dependent on workplace, formal employment in an urban workplace. So the logic is workers or migrant farmers will exchange land for urban residency. They will gain urban formal employment, although as Tauran said this morning, it's often not very easy. And only through formal employment, which means employment in a workplace with a contract, will they gain inclusion into the urban social insurance, pensions, and medical insurance, and other types of insurance like occupational injury. And that equals China's new style urbanization. So urbanization is built on this notion that land security will be exchanged for employment security. So that's just sort of a fundamental thing to understand for why workplace rights have been promoted by the government to such an extent since about 2008. And since 2008, China's labor protections now rank among the highest in the world, particularly for security, employment security. And the recent laws actually have had some effect on expanding the formal sector. You know, China looks much better than, say, India in that regard, and increased access to social insurance, particularly pensions, even among migrant workers. And so these laws we really need to take as part of this central government strategy to change the development model and force this kind of top-down urbanization, which is quite different than the urbanization that China had experienced for the last 30 years, which has been much more bottom-up, rural people going to cities, working in cities for a long period of time, but never having the opportunity to become full legal residents in the cities that they're working in. So this is really a much more top-down model, which has got these strategic goals behind it. So the OECD has tried to measure employment security. China is all the way on the very right-hand side with the highest level of protection. The black line is the OECD average. So China's labor laws on the books, of course, we know, of course, that enforcement and implementation are another thing altogether, are extremely protective. So when we think about how this is going to be done, and this is going to be a major part of my remaining remarks, and it gets to this problem of enforcement and compliance. So they've built these very good protections. They have not built the institutions that will improve enforcement and compliance, except by individual workers taking the law in their own hands and trying to protect themselves. And it's a very interesting model of labor regulation. It's somewhat similar to the United States, particularly if you're not in a unionized workplace, which most of us are not. So workers then must use these laws to try to protect themselves, and they've been encouraged by the government to do so. So the slogan, "Use the law as your weapon," is part of this campaign since the 1980s to encourage people to use the legal system to solve their own problems. And this cartoon is from an NGO book that they give out to migrant workers, and it's done in cartoons so anybody can really understand it. And it really demonstrates this because the woman, a migrant worker who was fired for getting married, is going to labor arbitration on her own, which is basically how it's done. If we think about the alternatives, you could have labor inspection, very, what's done in some other countries, very prominent labor inspection that goes in a kind of top-down, a proactive way. You could have trade union enforcement through collective contracts and bargaining, or you could have what China has, this kind of private action of individual employees protecting themselves. And the campaign, of course, put it in this way. This is from the 2008 white paper on China's legal system, talking about why these propaganda campaigns are done for rule of law. And it ends with, it is enabling them to use the laws as weapons to protect their lawful rights and interests. And again, emphasizing the idea that this is something you do on your own. This is something that is up to you to do. And the book talks a lot about what this means for enforcement and compliance. And of course, with this kind of system, you are going to see better compliance, but at the higher ends of the labor market. And it's very suboptimal for protection of people on the bottom. But I do want to give credit where credit is due, and I think if we look over this period of time from 2008 until now, we have seen improvements. We've seen wages increase, particularly for migrant workers. We've seen labor informality reduced, although contingent work has increased, and we've seen social insurance participation rates also improving. What we've also seen at the same time is really dramatically increased conflict, and this is what I want to talk about for the rest of my talk. So you can see that disputes have gone up. These are just the legal disputes. These are not strikes or demonstrations, and they tend to spike. Of course, they spiked in 2008 with the labor contract law, which was the major law. Of course, the global financial crisis also contributed to the increase in disputes because there were mass layoffs, and then again in 2010 with the social insurance law. And actually, since 2010, there have been major strikes, tens of thousands of workers, migrant workers, striking for social insurance, which, 10 or 15 years ago, none of us predicted. We thought migrant workers didn't care about pensions, and they do as they get older. And strikes and demonstrations have also increased. This is over time. Down here, this is the data from China Labor Bulletin, which collects, I think, this data most reliably. And this is just over this period of time, how many strikes have happened overall. This data is publicly available on their website. So lots of different cases. The Honda strike in 2010, which was more of a strike for increased wages. This was at a peak of the Chinese economy after the financial crisis. My favorite one is the Gangnam Style dancers who had not been paid their wages and decided if they danced the Gangnam Style in 2012, they would get attention from the media. And then just recently, more recently in 2014, really major strikes in the Pearl River Delta about social insurance. So my argument about what's happening with sort of rule of law or legal institutions and the development of Chinese society is that there is now this circular, vicious circle between law, instability, and expectations that have been unrealized, and then repression by the state. And what's really interesting about this sort of cycle of law, instability, and repression is that the government right now is repressing things that it previously championed. Weiquan, or this idea of rights protection, using the law as your weapon, was the government's slogan. It wasn't workers' slogans first, it was the government's slogan. But why has this panned out in the way that it has? So I'm going to sort of demonstrate this argument by talking about a single case, and I'm not going to talk about all the details of the case, but just to give you a sense of sort of how it plays out in a single incident. And this is a really interesting incident because it's also fairly unusual because the ACFTU, which is the Chinese official trade union, which is under the direction of the Communist Party, was sort of actively involved in the dispute, which it usually is not. So it begins with a Walmart store in Changde, Hunan, and it is going to be closed. Walmart in that year, this is in 2013 and 2014, closed about 10% of its stores across China as a part of restructuring. It wasn't actually leaving China or diminishing its investments in China. It was sort of reallocating where it was opening up stores, and it was closing these underperforming stores. So they announced the closure, they announced a very legalistic sort of settlement package and severance for the workers, and the workers begin what the state should expect them to do, which is use the law as their weapon. They're going to try to protect their rights, and they're going to try to get a better compensation. The workers then mobilized, they began a sit-in, and they began striking in front of the store. And this development continued as a lot of these strikes happen in China, because strikes are very, very common in China, although they're not really legal. And then the unexpected thing happened, which was the trade union chairman of the Walmart store, who was a former general administrative office manager, he was kind of in managerial ranks, decided he was going to do what unions do, which is protect workers. And so he decided to form a rights protection group. This is him on the left, this is Chairman Huang. And they began to really sort of strategize about the strike and about the sit-in and about negotiations with Walmart. Now, it's not really clear whether or not Walmart was doing something illegal or whether the workers were demanding something unreasonable. The point I'm going to make is, or I'm making, is that there was no place for this discussion to happen, except for the courts. And the workers didn't want to go to the courts. The workers wanted to stay and do collective bargaining. And this is what they attempted to do. So they mobilized, they began to try to bargain, and eventually it was repressed. And it was repressed because the upper level trade unions withdrew support from the trade union manager, Chairman Huang, and instructed him that the trade union may only demand the legal minimum, which I would say the legal minimum should not have to be demanded. The legal minimum is the legal minimum. What the workers were wanting in this kind of interest dispute, they were attempting to get a better negotiation and get a better package. But this institutional structure that the government had said was, the proper and legal structure through the ACFTU-led union was not permitted to work through that process. So an interest dispute between employers and employees with the representation of a trade union manager, a trade union officer, and a collective contract is not permitted to go through that process. What happens instead is the strike was disbanded, and workers were then directed to the legal system to file individual complaints. But the legal system is really ill-equipped to handle these types of disputes. The legal system can handle disputes where there's a clear violation, right? A clear legal violation. This was not really a clear legal violation. It was a disagreement about how to compensate workers for the closure and whether or not the workers could ask for more than Walmart was offering. The legal system really can deal with disputes that are about the violations of the law. They're very badly prepared and equipped to handle disputes that are about interests and differences. And even when the ACFTU, the trade union, did what it was supposed to do, even by what the government says they should do, this was not allowed or permitted to happen, which just seems to me to represent this kind of institutional problem that the government faces right now as to how to handle the rising expectations and the rising interest and the ability for people in society to mobilize collectively more effectively, partly due to social media and other types of technology. So it's really this sort of institutional gap or vacuum that presents itself to the government. How much more time do I have? Oh, okay. Well, I'm not going to take 6 minutes. I'm going to be done. So to talk about this institutional gap, I want to just briefly mention this speech that was quoted in the Chinese media in 2014 by Xi Jinping, which he gave to the Political Legal Affairs Committee of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. It was widely distributed in the official media as a scientific guidance for political legal work under the new normal being this slowing economy. And this quote in particular drew a lot of attention on the Chinese internet. Rights protection is the foundation of stability preservation. It's Wei Chuan and Wei Wen, so there's kind of this nice sounding thing of these two things together. And the crux of stability preservation is rights protection. So internet netizens in China really paid attention to this slogan. The line was then parodied on the internet, though probably censored within China, by matching that slogan with lines from Orwell's 1984. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength, stability preservation is rights protection. And the point that the netizens were making that this is either Orwellian doublethink or this is nonsense. But I want to suggest that it's neither, that it's something really more basic, which is that this slogan underlines the basic contradiction that confronts the central government. Rights protection and social inclusion is the only way for the regime to realize its goals for the shift in the development model and for urbanization. But the only mechanism for rights realization is through the mobilization of individualized workers who are not permitted to organize and not permitted to be represented. So not only is this suboptimal for rights realization, so enforcement and compliance will continue to be poor, it's also deeply destabilizing, and it exposes the failure to construct institutions that promote the realization of the rights that the government has promoted, and which are so closely linked to these fundamental economic goals. So when we think about what's going to happen to Chinese society in the future, or what's going to happen, as David's book and also Dan's book, China's Futures, talk about, we often juxtapose these two alternatives. One alternative is authoritarian resilience. The other alternative is democratic convergence. And so for labor, you can imagine authoritarian resilience might be state-led corporatism, labor aristocracy within the state sector and maybe high-end multinationals, and labor repression for everybody else. For democratic convergence, you might have independent trade unions, a vibrant civil society, an active legal profession that would advance those rights in the way that they're advanced in other parts of the world. But what I want to suggest that given the recent failure of the former, of the trade union, the official trade union, and the suppression of the latter, which is civil society and workers, the more likely scenario is something far worse than either of those two paths, satisfying neither autocrats nor democrats. Thank you.